Okay, now, where was I? I do believe I was telling you all a story about how the library grew. And it seemed to me that I was talking about my club brothers in TULSA, the Kinklings that were coming up to visit Jill and me every weekend, and the fact that the library just kept growing. And so, if I'm repeating myself here, forgive me. Uh, but Tulsa was an interesting experience in terms of leather history, because until Jill and I moved to Tulsa, I had actually never really thought about it. Yes, we had many of the treasures that, our mentors had given us. But until that next generation made Jill and me realize that our old stuff was actually their history, I had never really truly thought about its value. So it was an interesting learning experience, especially talking about the memories, the stuff that had been collected, and watching their eyes light up as they realized how much of that pertained to them. And so, carrying right on with this, let me say that when Jill and I moved from Oklahoma to Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, there was a lot more than just 7 boxes. To be quite honest, and since my spouse isn't around right now, I can say this. There were boxes of books and things, posters, art, programs, t-shirts, hidden all over the house. For those who saw the house in Tulsa, there were always curious questions about why the bookshelves, and I had bookshelves built in to our sunroom, were so deep. They were actually 14 inches deep. Uh, in some places, 16 inches deep. And yes, it served as a wonderful sidebar in some places where we could add food when we were hosting family dinners, and a place to put my tea set and all of those things that grandmoms have. But the reality was the bookshelves were made that deep so that they could be stacked first level all the way in, second layer, I should say, out, and none would be the wiser. Jill didn't figure out that the sidebar in the dining room was made of 4, 8, 10 crates of books, that behind the sofa in the corner were 7 or 8 crates of books, that there were crates of books and memorabilia in all the closets. There were even crates of books in her closet. She just didn't know. And it became mom's collection, and a collection that I was fairly proud of. And about a year or so after we moved back to the East Coast, which was 96, and of course, Jill becoming IMSL, was a major part of turning the stuff we had collected into a serious collection, donating a lot of it at the time to the Leather Archives and Museum, which is how Jill spent her IMSL year collecting history for the archives. That was, of course, before the library itself was born. And I found myself teaching a class on leather history that I called Leather History Show and Tell. And it was far less a class than mom at the time, mom, not grandma, mom's memories. I would cart behind me a little rolling suitcase of books, magazines, memorabilia, shirts, souvenirs, going all the way back to the very early 1900s. Pass them around and tell stories about them the way I did when I was in elementary school, when you brought something in to tell the class about, and it was called the show and tell. Now, there are a lot of wonderful memories that I have of those show and tells and doing them all over the country, actually. But at one point in time, a man named Scott Parker, he and his wife, Slavette, had been international master and slave in the mid 90s, came up to me and said, "Vi, I've been in your class 5 different times at this point, and I have never seen the same thing twice. How much of this do you own?" Well, I actually had to think about that because There was a lot of it, but exactly how much I had never really thought about. So he said, my wife and I are doing an event in the Carolinas this coming year. Would you bring it down and set it up for us? Kind of like a library. I said, sure. Hadn't really thought about it. Well, as they got nearer and I knew it was time to pack up, I rented a big cargo van and put everything in it, pulling boxes out of everywhere. And I was actually surprised at how much there was. So down to the Carolinas I drove. They gave me a big room in the vendor area, and it was the first time it was all set up. It surprised even me. And it stopped being that thing that mom does to kind of looking sort of professional. There were a lot of friends who joined me that weekend, aside from Scott and Slavette. And a lot of people went through that room and stayed, some for 15 or 20 minutes, some stayed for hours just reading. Fascinated actually by the fact that they could hold it, touch it, feel it. And I had realized a long time ago when I was doing the history show and tell that if you cannot touch your history, if you can't hold it and have an encounter with it, then it's just some faraway thing, like an incredibly boring history class. But if you can have it and hold it and touch it, it becomes a part of you, and therefore you a part of them. And for me, that was the most exciting part to watch, to see people connecting with who they were, who their leather ancestors were, and beginning to get a different understanding. Don't get me wrong, the academic is fine, but to get a more personal understanding of the joys, the highs, the lows, the sacrifices that have been made by Leathermen and women to bring the tribe to this point. So that was an exciting thing for me. Now, never crossed my mind that I would do it again. Went back to teaching the leather history show and tell. And at this point, beginning to consciously acquire things to supplement the kinds of things that I was traveling with. Occasionally old magazines, or old and rare books, or books from publishing houses that would make no sense to you all nowadays, because they're the kind of stuff that either you have found the books and you found them exciting, or it's an academic topic and it's really kind of boring. Until, of course, you actually get to put your hands on one. And speaking of putting your hands on one, the next stage of the story has to do with a book, specifically this beautiful piece called basically The History of Sex Lives in England. Now, to tell you the story about this book, which is actually where the third section of this story begins. I told you Jill and I had moved to Willow Grove, and two things happened. The new baby called eBay was just forming. And because we were in Pennsylvania, very near Philly, downtown Philly, the company called Comcast, I know some of you call it Comcrap, so did I, was testing the high-speed internet. Now we're going back to, I want to say 2002. And Willow Grove, our little town, was one of the first 5 towns wired for that high-speed internet. We were kind of an experiment. So along with this new auction house called eBay, and an incredibly fast connection, I had the privilege of bidding on a few things and being able to, the term we used back then was snipe, which was a rotten, horrible way of saying snatching a bid out from under someone who thought they had it at absolutely the last second. And being able to do the happy dance over it. Well, anyway, this book came up for sale. Now, to tell you a little something about this. The book is printed by Falstaff Press. Long story, Falstaff Press printed a lot of our wonderful literature in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. How you got on a list for Falstaff Press was not easy. But if you did, you got to be on a private mailing list for very expensive literature. Now, the reason I'm holding up this first page is so that you see that this is called a limited or numbered proof. Only X amount of copies were ever printed. And each one, in this case, was initialed. And you can see up here, only 50 copies of this particular edition were printed. And I wanted this book in order to explain, as I was doing Leather History Show and Tell, what it meant to have a limited print run. Sometimes numbered, sometimes just stated like this one, that it's one of 50 or one of 100 ever printed. The book came up for sale, and I was pretty sure it was going to go out of my price range. And yet I wanted it pretty badly. So I did all of the things you have to do on eBay, and I got everything set up. And I sat there with my finger on the button. And I watched it count down. Now, the reason I hadn't put in a bid before was because I was afraid I would get into a bidding war, and I just couldn't afford it, and the book would go out of my range. So the one person who had bid on the book didn't think he had any competition. 10 seconds, 9 seconds, 8 seconds, 7 seconds, 6 seconds. At 4 seconds, I pressed the button. At 2 seconds, my bid went in, and I became the high bidder. And 2 seconds later, the auction was over. I was betting that I had put in a high enough price, because no one had bid against him, that he didn't think the book would sell for that much money. And I knew that I had put in the price at the last minute, so there would be no time for him to come back against me. Well, needless to say, I won the book. I did the happy dance. And back in the day, eBay buyers could talk to each other. Of course, you can't now, but we could. So we began talking. Now, in my mind, I was hoping that I had found another buyer of erotica, because the other thing that was visible was your entire purchase history. And I was hoping I had found a kindred spirit who could help me find books that I wanted in a price that I could afford. As we exchanged emails, and the emails made me more and more uncomfortable, I ultimately found out that yes, he was a buyer, but he was being paid by the Christian Right, as were other friends of his, to buy our history, to destroy it for the sake of the children. Zero to ballistic at pretty frightening speeds. Part one of that tale. Now let's put that over here for a minute. About a month later, I had to be in Atlanta for Southeast Leather Fest, an event that I adored and hadn't missed at that point. And a young man came up to me and said, "Miss Johnson, may I talk to you?" Now, I was still getting used to the Miss Johnson part, because Miss Johnson was my mother. I was just Mom or Vi. But anyway, I said, "Sure." And over the course of about 45 minutes to an hour, sitting in the lobby, he asked my advice on something. He had a little gaming store, New Age, and it's been so long, I want to say Dearborn, Michigan. And there had been a book burning in front of his store, and he was afraid for his clients. I talked him out of going out of business, which was his question. And, with all of the things of If you do, they win. Uh, it's the way bullies react. He's trying to scare you and so on. And when that conversation was over, I remember going back up to my hotel room and I was shaking, screaming angry. Those of you who know me know what I think of book burners. I wouldn't, and I've said this before, I wouldn't use Mein Kampf for toilet paper, but I wouldn't let you burn it either. Burning books is wrong, and I'm going to stay off that soapbox for everyone's sanity. But that day, it went from that thing that I did to a library, because I swore, never again, not on my watch. You don't get to destroy my children's history. You just don't. So if I could afford it, buy it, borrow it, beg it, steal it, get it somehow to save it for the next generation, that's what I was going to do. Now, to that end, and after making that vow, I have had an extremely understanding family. Robbie, most of you know, Robbie is the wind beneath not just my wings, but the wings of the library. My very indulgent partner, Jill, who, like I said, after spending her entire year collecting memorabilia for the Leather Archives and Museum, effectively our big brother. And no, we are not the same organization, but that's another story. Would have no problem with me collecting and saving history. Talking about the size of the collection, the kinds of things it holds, and why each and every piece of it is important will be the next piece of this story. But now you've gotten this far, and it's time for Mom to end her tale.